Welcome to the London Library and to tonight's event, which is the book launch of One Language, This Book, the stunning debut poetry collection by Anastasia Taylor-Lind. I'm Claire Berliner, I'm head of programmes here at the library, which means I'm responsible for public events like this, but also our Emerging Writers programme, of which Anastasia is a recent alumna. For anyone who doesn't know the library already, this is the reading room. It's the heart of what is something of a labyrinth. It houses over 1 million books on 17 miles of shelves. It was founded in 1841 by a group of writers and friends who wanted to establish a lending library in London and a place they could come together to write, learn and create, as well as celebrate each other's work. So it is apt that we are celebrating the work of a member of our writing community tonight. We've had many illustrious members in over the last 181 years. Those of you here in person will have seen pictures of some of them as you came up the stairs. Virginia Woolf, H.G. Wells, E.M. Forster and Muriel Spark. We've also had many poets in membership, such as T.S. Eliot, Alfred Lord Tennyson and Edith Sitwell, as well as lots of visual artists and photographers, Vanessa Bell, Gluck, Cecil Beaton and John Berger, to name but a few. Which brings us to tonight and this book, which contains both poetry and images and explores both forms as crucibles by which we can view and understand violence, war, and also humanity. Anastasia Taylor-Lind, hello, is a poet and photojournalist whose work covers issues relating to women, war, and violence. She's a National Geographic magazine photographer, a TED Fellow, and a 2016 Harvard Neiman Fellow. She has, until about 2 weeks ago, been in Ukraine covering the conflict from the front line. She's also reported from various regions around the world, but a number of times from Ukraine, including the Maidan Revolution and the conflict in the Donbass. And we're going to hear about those areas as well as Anastasia's recent experience. But before we do, we're going to kick off. We're going to start at the very beginning because it is a very good place to start. We're going to start with the first poem in the collection and also a little video and hear about Anastasia's route into photojournalism. So, we have a clicker.
We do have a clicker.
Should we start with the video?
Hi. Thank you so much, Claire. And thank you so much to all of you for coming along. It's pretty exciting for me to have written a book of poems. The writing part wasn't as exciting as this, that's for sure. But I've been coming into the library, well, not every month, but I should have been coming into the library every month as part of the Emerging Writers Programme.
You had quite a good excuse.
Everyone's forgiving me at the moment. But usually I'm sitting on that side and listening to Claire have a conversation with one of the writers who's been brought in to talk to the Emerging Writers Programme. So yeah, it's fun to be sat here and a little bit nerve-wracking as well. And hello to everyone who's tuned in. Tuned in? Am I like 70? What's it called? Watching online? Zooming? I don't quite know what it is, but hi, and thank you so much for being here as well.
I forgot to say actually, because we've had a small technical issue, which is that the images are not going through to the live stream. Hopefully online you can pick them up from this screen, but if you're struggling, don't worry, because we'll send a link with the images inserted into the talk. That will make sense when you watch the video. But anyway, we'll start. Go for it.
The beginning.
The beginning.
I have a video of the beginning, or close to it. This is my mum and our horse Star, and behind her is Blue. And this was me when I was a few days or weeks old. At this point, my parents were traveling horse-drawn, and they'd stopped at a place called Cricklade Common in the Cotswolds. I was born in the hospital, not under the back wheel of a cart, as my dad liked to tell people. Here he is harnessing up Blue to go into town. And I share this just because sometimes it's easier to show this short home clip than it is to describe the slightly unusual circumstances that me and my brother Dan grew up in. But once our parents settled, they bought a field, and we grew up in Devon, living off-grid without electricity or running water. As a result, no TV, so we never watched TV. My parents didn't take newspapers, so my world as a small child was pretty much imageless. But we went to the library once a week on the cart with Shadowfax or Blue, and me and Dan took out 8 books each week, and we read those. And I enjoyed poetry most of all. My dad had a book, one of the few books that we actually owned. What was it called? The Nation's Greatest Poems. And Tennyson's Charge of the Light Brigade was in that, and I absolutely loved it since I was really small. So actually, the first profession that I wanted to be when I grew up was a war poet. I knew already that was probably the job for me. But when I was 16, I discovered a book of photographs by Don McCullin of the Vietnam War. And I think...
There's one right there.
Yes, it had this picture in it of a shell-shocked soldier in Hue. And I guess I must have thought that taking pictures would be easier than writing poems.
To be discussed.
Some ways true, in some ways not. So when I was 16, I took that book to my A-level photography tutor and said, how do I learn to do this? And he sort of set me off on the path in that direction. So it was a long time until I came back to poetry, or came to it really, because I hadn't written poetry before. I just enjoyed reading it.
Do you want to read Rewind?
Yeah, so this is the first poem from my book, and my more experienced poetry friends had said, once your book's published, you'll notice all these little bits that you want to change, and you'll rewrite your poems. And I said, that will never happen to me. But I changed I put it into roughly 4-line stanzas, and I changed the line breaks a little bit with the help of my professor, Glyn Maxwell, and Tammy Yusilov. So here's the slightly updated version, but essentially the same poem. It's called Rewind. Rewind. It's 9/11, the first time you stay. In the morning, you bring Taliban poems back to bed. I drink cardamom coffee, and you read their tender lines. May you not be hungry in the desert, my dear. They're loving as ordinary as mine. I see wilding men shouldering RPGs by the swimming pool of a warlord's compound and think they're beautiful. Watch a dentist fall to earth from an aeroplane rising over Kabul. Human payload slipping from the undercarriage, falling through swipes, scrolls, and clicks. Rewind the tapes. See the little man flying upwards, returning to his life. Rewind the tapes. Like Bruegel's Icarus, he touches down with a splash in a rooftop water tank 4 kilometers away, his suffering unnoticed except for a casual cell phone recording. 20 years ago, the Twin Towers man fell too. Twisting and turning, tie fluttering, past flames and smoke, for a moment head first over Manhattan. Rewind the tapes. See the little men flying upwards, returning to their lives. Rewind the tapes. We lie under a marigold-embroidered bedspread bought in Afghanistan. My old friend Tom took me on that shopping trip in an armored vehicle with his bodyguard. And I remembered the summer before the end of uni, how he and I sat up late drinking Jameson, listening to Johnny Cash, and imagining our own deaths together somewhere in a dusty alley. All golden light, slow motion, and elevated camera angles. We took it in turns, who was doing the dying and who was doing the cradling.
It's, I wanted to start with that because it says so much about photography, war photography, your way into it. There's a kind of distance at play in it. You're very matter of fact watching this man falling out of the sky, and obviously distance is also an element of photography. It's also that kind of distance is echoed in the next poem in the collection, which is First Nat Geo Assignment, in which there's two policemen prodding a drowned baby, and a woman very casually, whilst men are just fishing behind her, says, "Oh, it's probably a girl." And you, all the way through the collection, there's this kind of distance, which seems to be something's happening with my sound. All the way through the collection, there's a thing about distance and violence, and the people who you're distancing yourself, the people who are surrounded by violence distancing themselves. I just wondered if that kind of simultaneously being inured to violence and appalled by it is a necessary dichotomy that you have to have as a war photographer.
That's a good question. Don't we all have it, really? I mean, a fascination with the things that frighten us most? Or maybe not, I'm projecting, that's just my experience.
And do we partly have it because we see images of war? So we become, and that's actually something people have said a lot about the current conflict, about how, everyone's very concerned at the beginning, but then it's going to tail off and people are going to start thinking about other things, or another conflict's going to come along and people are going to concentrate on that. So yeah, you're right, we all do it to an extent.
I suppose the thing is that in my poems, well, in the first half of my collection, and in all of my photojournalistic work, my presence and my point of view is as an observer. So I'm watching violence inflicted by one group of people on another, or I'm looking at the aftermath or the repercussions of that in my poems too. And you can never really break that barrier between being between experiencing violence and witnessing it. Although I don't mean it to sound patronizing, but even witnessing violence seems perhaps that you might get closer to understanding it if you haven't witnessed it. But really, there's no way. I mean, all I'm trying to get close to for myself, not necessarily for anyone else, in my poems and my photography, is to try and understand for myself what it might be like for this person or this person. Because it's, I know it's pointing out the obvious as well, but the wars that I'm reporting on or I'm writing poems about aren't always happening here, although certainly part of that warmongering takes place in the UK, but they're happening in other places to other people in other communities, and that's a really, really different point of view or eye to write from in poetry. I know it doesn't really answer your questions, but that's sort of what swirls around my head when you say it.
Well, it leads actually to my next one, which is how do you balance the photography is always simultaneously objective and subjective, and how do you balance the need to bear witness and your job to tell the world about what's happening with your own perspective and the fact that you're bringing yourself into a situation?
Well, that's a good question as well, that I don't necessarily know the answer to, but poetry certainly helps me do it. Like after 15 years or so as a photojournalist, I began to feel really frustrated with the medium. There's this sort of cliched old adage that no one actually knows who to attribute it to, but that goes in journalism: the story should never, ever be about you. It should always be about somebody else. And while that's true, and it might sound honorable, what it also does, I believe, is brushes aside the fact that reporting and photographs are made by human beings, and so everyone brings their biases to it. Of course, I thought when I first saw Don McCullen's pictures of Vietnam that those were objective pictures, but of course now I know that they couldn't be. So poetry I mean, I'm allowed to say I. I'm not allowed to say I in any of the captions to my pictures or in any of my reporting, because it's about the stories of other people. But of course, in reporting other people's stories, I have experiences myself, and I have a whole life that I live too. And since I guess I'm a creative person, I want to be able to speak about that as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and there's a section of the book called Field Notes, which is poetry, and poetry that's kind of in note form, but it is still poetry. And there's a few, I think in 3 of those, you make an observation and then you say, I feel bad for thinking that. And so, why are people burning down their houses rather than let the enemy take them over? I feel like that seems crazy to me.
Yeah.
I feel bad for thinking that. So that conflict must be going on in your head all the time.
Yeah, the voices never shut up, especially when I'm out reporting like that, because there are, I suppose the word moral seems like a bit too much, but even so who the storytellers are shape what stories get told, of course, as we know, in writing and documentary and photography too, and the biases that those people bring with them. And it's a hugely unequal industry dominated by middle-aged, straight, white men from the world's richest countries. Sorry, I lost my chain of thought. I always get stuck on that point.
Who's telling the story?
Who's telling the story? And also, I don't want to use the word self-censoring, especially not when we're talking about the conflict in Ukraine. But I also have to make decisions about, well, is this a story is it right to tell this story now? Is this the right time? Or should my focus be on this now? I mean, just as one example, when the war started, there were a lot of stories in the media about foreign and American and Western volunteers working in, going to Ukraine to volunteer. And while that's interesting and important, I didn't feel I wanted to amplify those stories over stories of Ukrainians who were doing the same thing.
Yeah,
that's a bit of a tangent.
No, but there's one of those notes. I'm gonna read it because it's really interesting about what the expectations are on you, but also you're kind of a formula basically for capturing war. How to tell a war story in pictures. Always photograph wounded soldiers, frightened civilians, mourning relatives, the aftermath of shellings, food queues, the bus station, daily life continuing as normal. Wait outside the emergency department for casualties, look for fresh graves at the cemetery, drive to the front line and see what happens. You were saying that's the formula, but it's interesting that's what we get as well for, when we're reading the paper and we're seeing those images.
Yeah, I was thinking about that when I was a little bit very creatively stuck on my last trip to Ukraine. And I thought, actually, this is, it's kind of distasteful to hear put out like that, but that is a recipe for a photojournalistic war story. It works, and I typed it out on my phone and I did that again.
Yeah, and Susan Sontag in this book with Don McCullough on the front talks about photography. Photography has only one language and is destined potentially for all, and she's comparing that to written journalism, and what we see in the image and what we see, and how everyone can understand that image.
It's one of the reasons. There are lots of reasons to be down about photography and its limitations, and certainly photojournalism when it comes to representing conflict. But one of the really beautiful things about it, I guess, like painting and some other visual arts, is that anyone, anywhere in the world can understand it. It is a universal language. And so in that sense, it's very democratic.
And talking of language, there's also a lot of crossover between the lexicon of photography and the lexicon of war. And that is something you deal with in your poem shooting. Do you want to read that?
Yeah, I'd love to. This poem is written in part about being or photographing in Maidan Square during the Maidan Revolution in 2014. And I'll also show you some pictures that were made while I was writing these, that relate to these, that relates to this poem. Oh, I'm still nervous. I thought it would wear off by now. I'll just shake it out. Okay. And remember to read slowly. Shooting. What have you been shooting? An editor asks one afternoon. In the south of France, table service, Aperol spritz, sunglasses and sunshine. We say we shoot people. Fire shutters, take pictures, capture subjects with cameras, and expose them onto film. Warfare's words ingrained in our lexicon. The Comanche married guns and horses on the Great Plains. Combining speed and firepower changed the battlefield forever. Cameras again. I wonder what shutter speed Kappa shot the falling soldier with. Perhaps 125th of a second. Fast enough to capture the moment of death for the first time. One afternoon another year, under a sunless grey sky, Berahina looks out from her pedestal on the black square. Men stretcher the wounded down a hill, leaving a trail of bright red arterial blood across the cobblestones, fresh and thick. I follow, picking my way through smouldering debris and broken glass, my face covered with soot from burning tires, a Maidan tan. Corpses lie under a barricade, each tucked in with a blanket, grey and waxy faces, blue lips, each with a single bullet hole to the forehead or chest, each ready for his close-up. I shoot them like everybody else. Under a hot shower at night, the water runs black over my feet.
Thank you. Do you want to show us the pictures from Maidan?
Yes, and also maybe apologize to anyone who's watching online because the pictures are not going to be in there, right? Yeah, I know you said
they'll be able to see this.
Okay.
But it won't be
I
as
won't
great.
spend too much time on this, just to give you an idea of the process and how my pictures, how I try to make pictures and photographs. No, that's the same thing. Poems. It's confusing because they both begin with the same letter. This is Zhenya. I made a series of portraits. Oh, hi. This is my niece, Eartha, who just woke up and looks very sleepy. I made a series of portraits in a makeshift portrait studio inside the barricades in Maidan Square in Kiev during the 2014 revolution. I made hundreds of portraits, actually. These are just a few portraits of men as they were approaching the barricades to sort of on a shift rotation to man the frontline barricades that were facing the Berkut, the riot police. And this is my friend Maxime in 2014. He'd had his hand broken by the Berkut. And I'll tell you more about him later. But so I set up a makeshift. It's hard to talk about photography after thinking about poetry as well. Actually, now I'm thinking they're so different. I stayed for a month. I made hundreds of portraits of protesters who were manning the barricades. On the worst day of violence, which was the 20th of February 2014, I also made pictures. not in the studio because the center of the square was burning, but I turned back to this formula that I wrote about in Nagorno-Karabakh of telling war stories. More than 60 people were killed by snipers in Maidan Square in a few hours, and a day later, President Yanukovych fled to Russia, and the revolution was considered a success. They disposed Yanukovych, and after those days, tens of thousands of civilians started streaming into the square to leave flowers, first on the bloodstains on the cobbles and on the street, and then they covered the barricades, and then they covered the whole of Maidan Square in a blanket of flowers. And so I photographed the women as they approached the same barricades. My portrait studio was in the same place, and I asked them to make portraits. This is Olena and Ostap, who was 6 months old at this time. I asked to make a portrait before they put their flowers down. I hadn't planned to make actually it became a monograph. It was my first photography book, but I hadn't planned to make a series of portraits. I didn't know that women were going to bring flowers, but when I saw it, I remembered, that the Pete Seeger song, "Where Have All the Flowers Gone?" that my mum used to sing to us when we were kids. And I thought, oh, maybe I should just keep photographing the same. But it was also the point where I started to start thinking much more clearly about gender, sort of this gender division in terms of war and conflict and warmongering. 99.9, I can't quite remember, but almost all of combatants in all of recorded history have been men. So war is always gendered. We're seeing it again, of course, now in Ukraine because of the war, but also because women are the only ones who are able to flee, women and children. Men of conscription age, I think it's 18 to 60, are forbidden from leaving the country. So suddenly, when war shows up unannounced or unexpected, as it always is, men and women occupy different roles, but also they're forced apart. The nature of war means, I believe in order for war to take place, you have to separate men and women. It's if you want war to take place, of course I don't, but there's something about separating men and women and creating this very unnatural environment that makes it easier to get people to kill each other. It's really hard to get human beings to kill each other. You have to do so much work beforehand. When you arrive at the point where mostly men are picking up weapons and murdering other people, or killing them, and they're being killed back, so much groundwork has been laid in order for that to take place. Really, human beings don't want to kill other people. It's very, very difficult to make them do it, and especially en masse. And of course, as we all know, the beginning of that process starts always with words.
They're amazing images. They're beautiful. You also write about what it is to be how annoying it is when people call you a woman journalist. But all those ways that gender plays into your role, what you're seeing. When did you decide that you wanted to give voice to women in war? Because that is really a big part of your project, both in the poetry and in the images. And also, how have you countered that that idea that photojournalism is also a male domain?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I really appreciate the note that you sent yesterday saying, I'd love you to talk about covering like war and gender, but don't worry, I'm not going to ask you what it's like to be a female photojournalist.
There's an assumption, isn't there, that it's inherently more dangerous or something, and actually you talk about that. You talk about misogyny, that exists, But that it's not actually necessarily more dangerous. It's dangerous for everybody.
It's more dangerous to be a woman, period.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter where you are, in my opinion. Or you're more likely to be at the receiving end of violence. But that's a whole other sort of thing to think about. Like writing poems about my experience, almost all my poems, with the exceptions of the ones where I talk about my childhood, were written based on experiences that I had while reporting as a photojournalist. Like, photography is my way of going out and being in the world and living in a really open and wholehearted way, and also having a lot of, like, feeling a lot of things, like a lot of very extreme emotions that then help me to write afterwards. Like, you have to experience something in order to write, right? So right now, that's what I'm doing in Ukraine still. So writing poems, particularly the first long poem in the collection about Nagorno-Karabakh, made me, or helped me understand a little bit more this, how my gender, and also how the choices that I make in terms of whose stories to tell are influenced by my gender. I mean, I write it in the first poem: men with guns are dangerous, and drunk men with guns are even more dangerous. And
but then nothing actually happens. Nothing happens,
and I feel bad for thinking that. But I'm always thinking about that. And you know, there are some amazing, amazing photojournalists, like the late Tim Hetherington, who photographed men at war in the most beautiful and intimate and loving way. All of his work in the Korangal Valley in Afghanistan and other places. And I know when I see that work that I can never make work like that. I just can't. I can never have those connections with people because we're different genders. And I see it and I feel it now when I'm working in the east of, in Donbass, in the east of Ukraine, like a little bit closer to the front line. I find it much more difficult to build those relationships with male soldiers than I do with female civilians. Like, it's just, I feel safer, I feel more comfortable. I mean, it's not the only reason why I'm telling those stories, but there's a practicality to it as well, and I'm not complaining about it. It's just I have to accept that I am who I am. And so and that will affect, like, who I can have stronger relationships with, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about Lee Miller's images, which are, they weren't like her male counterparts, and she was able to do all kinds of things that they wouldn't have been able to do. It offers a completely different perspective, and it's important to have that perspective.
Because of where you are physically standing, or where you may or may end up being able to stand. And it's not like, oh, well, women can't go to the front line because I'm not strong enough to wear my flak jacket or something. Of course I can go to the front line. It's not, it's not about all of those old-fashioned ideas. It's just like, where is the place that I can build real, deep, meaningful friendships with the people that I'm photographing? And it's based on that. And do you know, I think I see something similar in war poetry, and certainly it's true of war photography, that we have this idea that war poetry and war photography are pictures and poems that are made on the front line, usually by soldiers and certainly of soldiers. So first of all, war happens in a war zone, which is a specific designated place, and you're either in it or you're not. And then beyond that, war photography and war poetry happens along what's known as the front line, or the second line, or the third line. And it's about the experience of combatants. And that is an important story to tell. And there are lots of people telling it, and rightly so. I think it's important to have those pictures and to also have poems that help us understand what that experience might have been like for the men who were there. But that's not the stories that I'm choosing to tell, that I'm right now.
Which actually leads us very neatly into your images of Donbass. and then another poem.
Yeah. So the Maidan Revolution, or the end of the Maidan Revolution, was really the start of the most violent period of recent Ukrainian history. A few days after President Yanukovych fled the country, Russia annexed, stole, occupied, took, we can say, annexed is the word that has been most popular to use up to now, took Crimea. And then a separatist war started in the east of the country in this region that's known as Donbass. And that conflict has been the most active phase of the 2014 war, led into 2015, and then the war in Donbass largely became known as the Forgotten War, or a frozen conflict. And for the last 5 years now, I've been working together with a writer called Alisa Sopova, who is also an anthropologist now, and she's from Donetsk city itself. And we've been working on this project, which we've always sort of tentatively called 5K from the front line. Alyssa liked this idea because she said, she lives in America now, and she said, well, everyone runs like 5K in the morning, and that, you know, people, you foreigners in peaceful places know what 5K means because you run it. So let's call it 5K from the front line. And so
I don't know what it means, but sure.
I don't either. I'm not a runner. This is a town called Marinka, which is still under the control of the Ukrainians. Half of the town is under the control of the Ukrainians, half of the Russians, but it's very, we weren't able to visit Marinka this time. You could say the front line is there now. This picture was taken in 2019, when we went to photograph the presidential elections. Afterwards, Zelensky was elected, so this was on polling day in Marinka. This picture was taken in Avdiivka, which again is, you could say, right on the front line. It's being hit every day by missiles, rockets, aerial bombardments. I mean, again, we weren't able to go there. Now we tentatively call the project 15K from the front line, because also the game changed a lot since 2014. There weren't these long-range artillery weapons being used. It was mostly shelling and Grad missiles, so it was, I mean, it seemed more than 10,000 people were killed. And that's probably a conservative estimate in 2014-15. But of course, that pales in comparison to how many people have been killed now. And so, yeah, the conflict looks very different. In fact, it kind of looks like this still, because it's really, really dangerous, but you can't always see the threat. And it's really quite safe and normal until suddenly and very instantly it's not. This is just outside Avdiivka as well. We went with a group of pensioners who were being taken by a Ukrainian volunteer called Radion to visit the graves of their relatives, which they hadn't been able to visit for 3 or 4 years because the area was mined. So he took them through a safe part. This is the Grinic family, who I've just spent some time with on this last trip to Ukraine. Nikolai on the left used to work at the coal coke plant in Avdiivka, and it stayed open all through the first part of the war in 2015, because the director and everybody, the whole town was built around the factory, and if it was shut down, it would never be possible to restart it. And it closed several months ago. It had been hit for the last 8 years many times, but everyone kept working there. And I think just a few weeks ago, Nikolai volunteered to join the army, while Ollie and the kids fled to Poltava and are staying with a relative there. I have a picture of that. This is the lunch they made us when we went for a picnic one time. And this is Kirill playing on his mum's iPhone when he'd just woken up. He was about, I don't know, how old does he look? A year and a half, 2 years, something like that. So Alyssa and I have been spending time with the same families in the same towns consecutively over the last 5 years. And this is Lena at the back with her son on one summer a few years ago. And Nikolai showing Mira how to fish. All the time you can hear shelling in the distance. While most of these pictures were made, it was along the front line, but the front line was static, so we didn't believe there was ever really a risk that would move, or that, and there were no Russian troops on the ground officially, according to Russia. So it was it's a completely different situation. So this is Alyssa and me. The picture on the left is the first time we met, or the day after our first meeting, and we're wearing these beautiful floral fabrics because we were in Svetogorsk Monastery, the Lavra. And so we were reporting on aid distribution to refugees, and so we had to wear these coverings. And this is us about 2 weeks ago, also in Donbass, near a town called Karlovka, which we've also visited every time we've been there for the last 5 years. And I wrote a poem for Alyssa, so I want to read it to you. And I also have to have a big slug of water. Excuse me 1 second. Actually, this was one of the first poems I ever wrote. I always sort of, when you have those thoughts where you're like, oh, in another lifetime, I would have liked to have been this. So I was still always like, oh, in another lifetime, I would have liked to have been a war poet. But that seemed even less likely than being a war photographer, which still seemed very unlikely to me. And actually, it was interesting. It was just after my dad died 5 years ago. I signed up for an introduction to poetry writing class at the Faber and Faber Academy. And I wrote this poem then, but I didn't show it to anyone. And I definitely, apart from the other poets in the class, and I definitely didn't show it to Alyssa because I was kind of embarrassed. Until like maybe a year ago, I was like, I'm putting this in a book, is that okay? And we were talking about it actually because so Alyssa's a journalist, a writer, but she's doing a PhD at Princeton in anthropology, looking at separatist movements and also like the way that civilians adapt to sort of the structure of war. And sort of the complexities of living along the front line or by a front line that's been cut. And she is obsessed with pot plants. The last trip we were on, the same, everywhere we went, she'd always be interviewing people. I see there's a geranium over there. Who was the last one to water it? So this is kind of about that. It's called Welcome to Donetsk. Actually, and it was written, the notes for this were made in Donetsk. I only visited Donetsk, which became part of the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic in 2014 or 15. It hasn't really been possible for foreign journalists to get press accreditation to visit since then. And even if I did get it, Alyssa always said there was no way she'd go back there with me because she'd probably be put in a basement, which is no joke. So there was one time I got to visit Donetsk, and Alyssa, we had a day off from our reporting, and Alyssa said, let's go by foot and I'll show you my old neighborhood. Welcome to Donetsk. You teach me this wartime trick, to look for living pot plants in the windows on Kievska Avenue. Most are crisped and brown, but one green geranium and a succulent spider plant offer proof of life for the person who waters them. Whole apartment blocks are abandoned, collapsed telephone lines, blown up branches litter the road. No voices, no tinkering metalwork in the distance, no buses, no playing children. Leaves rustle, white noise. You say, it's like Sunday every day. Stray dogs and swallows, and the soft thud of shelling.
Thank you. It's that poem is really it's really suggestive of what poetry can do that photography can't necessarily do, which is that it kind of zooms in on these details like the pot plants. If you just photograph the pot plants on their own, we wouldn't see.
That is what Alyssa wants me to do, though. Every
sure
time.
She does.
I'm trying to explain to her it won't work.
But you need the poem alongside it.
Yeah.
And you've got another poem where you do that. I'm just going to read the first two lines.
Yeah.
It is, although I'm going to mess up the pronunciation. The
Don't
hair
worry about
salons in
Stepanakert.
closed in late September. Women's roots are as long as the war, a grey inch for each month. That's something you can do in poetry. You could take a photo of it, but it wouldn't have the same resonance, I don't think.
And really, that's just a note of an actual reporting technique. Literally, if someone comes out of a basement, the first thing I do anyway is check to see how long women's roots are, so I can think to ask them, oh, it looks like you've been down here a while, or something like that, you know, to kind of have an idea of it. It was the same in Bucha, when I went there just after the Russians had withdrawn and the Ukrainians had taken the Kiev suburb back. You could tell how long women had been sheltering from by the regrowth on their gel nails and their hair. It seems flippant. I don't mean it in a flippant way at all.
It's not flippant, it's the detail. I mean, it seems to me that is another thing that you as a woman would notice and can bring to the reporting. I mean, maybe that's a gendered assumption on my part, but
no, completely.
What for you? When did you've talked about when you started writing poetry? Has it been kind of continual? What is it that you can express through poetry that you haven't been able to do through photography?
Well, I can take not all, but the most important or the most searing experiences that I have, and I'm not able to capture in photographs, and it means I can tell a story about them. So really, again, it's just this, I have an idea of something that I want to say or a story I want to tell. And sometimes, I mean, you know, this adage that a picture speaks 1,000 words. I mean, it can speak more than 1,000 words in some instances, but it can also say absolutely nothing. And actually, do you know, I have this great quote by Louise Gluck. And she's the first, I mean, maybe there are others who are writing about it, but she's the first poet I came across writing about journalism. In any case, there's this, which, and it just rings so true to me. News stories are detailed, but they don't seem at all real. Their thoroughness is a reprimand to imagination, and yet they don't say what it was to be here. And I think writing poems lets me say what it was like for me to, I mean, that's all you can do. Oh, that's all I can do as a poet, really, is say what something was like for me.
And you've continued to write poetry whilst taking photographs in Ukraine recently. So you've got 3 poems that you've written recently.
Yes.
Would you like to do those first? Or we're doing terribly for time, but it's all too good,
God.
so I just want to carry on. That's my fault. I'm supposed to be on top of it.
I'm going to be really quick.
Yeah,
but I just wanted to tell you a little bit about the people. I know, like, there are so many photographs and there are so many stories to tell. And I just got back from Ukraine, and I don't have I haven't got finished scans of the pictures to show you. So these are just 2 contact sheets. You remember Lena sitting at the kitchen table with her son. Her garden was shelled. and she was injured pretty badly, actually, by shrapnel in the back and in her right buttock. And so we visited her at the hospital in Pokrovsk. So again, oh, yeah. And Kirill, the little boy with the bare bum, who was 1 or 2, that's him on the top left. And this isn't for the project, but it's just a really nice picture of Alyssa sitting at our kitchen table in Kiev a few weeks ago. And Zhenya, I mean, the people who fought in Maidan were often the first to volunteer if they weren't in the armed forces already when the Russians invaded in February. Zhenya joined the army immediately, and Maxim joined a volunteer battalion. This picture was taken in Kiev in March, and so was this one of Maxim on the right. And he was killed on a mission about 2 weeks ago. They found his body on Sunday, and they buried him yesterday in Poltava, which was his hometown. This is Bucha. You've probably heard about it. A suburb of Kiev. And this is Hostomel. And I have some new poems that are relatively close to sort of the notes that I made of them, or at least they resemble the notes. And I just wanted to, talk a little bit about how I'm mixing the reporting for poems and the reporting for photography. And I'm also having to, because I'm doing a master's in writing poetry at the poetry school now. And so I have to hand in 10 poems and an essay 3 times a year. And I'm so glad that I'm smart enough to know that I can't do things on my own. I need to be taught how to do them, and I also need the accountability of other poets and of my professors. So, I'm writing quite quickly after I've reported. I don't have the luxury of sort of time and rumination, and I'm sure the poems that I write about the things I saw here will be very, in 10 years' time, will be very different to the ones I would write now. So when I was making these pictures in Hostomel, I was also making voice notes just on my iPhone and typing just lines as they came to me, thinking that I might be collecting observations, reportage observations for poems. So I have 3 poems that relate to the pictures. This one first. One sec. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm getting this in the wrong order. All I have is a list of things. All I have is a list of things. Empty windows in Hostomel wave as I walk by, the bright fabrics of each living room billowing like handkerchiefs. Apartment facades smashed open, homes like dolls' houses. Kitchen, cabinets, bathroom, bath, bookcase full of books. Emergency workers dig for bodies in the debris. A man in uniform abseils down an open wall with a body tied into a rope. The dead man splits the body bag and falls 3 stories while his mother watches. Kids, written on printer paper and taped to windshields. Along the highway, car after car stopped, shot out. Every driver's door flung open. Abandoned Russian positions littered with half-filled bottles of piss. Plastic bottlenecks, all touched by the soft tips of soldiers' dicks as they kept watch at these windows. At night, somewhere in the city, outgoing, gugum, 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 distant as thunder through the double glazing, 20 kilometers away. Someone is suffering under this. pictures are all from Bucha residents are watching the excavation of a mass grave. And I've also been moving all over the country. Until very recently, almost all of my work was based in Donbass together with Alyssa. But since the war has spread all over the country, it's meant we've moved about a lot, covering stories about refugees who've been displaced from the Donbass into further west into Ukraine. The list. Go to the hospital. Civilians injured by a cluster munitions attack on Kramatorsk railway station as they were queuing for an evacuation train. And also a story about surrogate mums. Surrogacy is a massive industry in Ukraine. So I spent a lot of time in Lviv following the story of two mums who are carrying foreign children. And I was also in a town called Trostianets, which is in Sumy region, to the east of Kiev, reporting for The Guardian. And I made this picture there. And this picture was sort of the starting point, or the experience of making this photograph was the starting point for a short poem, which I'll read to you now. It's called Blundstones. Blundstones, probably you know, are the sort of Australian riding boots, and for some reason, I don't know why, they're kind of like part of a journalist's uniform. Like, everybody wears them, including me. Blundstones. My boots crunching over shards of broken glass all day. In the regional administrative offices, an apartment block on Blahovenshinskaya, at the hospital, outside the Forestry Commission, in the yellow bus, shatter-resistant chunks, in dark red blood on the floor, a blood-soaked hat, old blood. I think I have blood on my boots, mixed with mud, drying into the rubber mat on the car floor. And the last short poem, written about a picture that I made, but I don't think I'll ever show anyone. It's called Morgue. Morgue. By the door, the body curled, stiff in the fetal position. I meet her for the first picture, and the light drops, sun suddenly, behind a cloud. I know this, but still the darkness startles me. That's just a homeless guy, says the soldier, unzipping body bags to show us the last 3 Russians in town.
Thank you. I'm going to very briefly go back to the book, and then we're going to go to questions. You end by rewinding. you start with a poem called Rewind, and you end the book by going back to your childhood. And in a long sequence of poems called Stories No One Wants to Hear. And it's a meditation on violence and how it also really speaks to what poetry can do that photographs can't necessarily do, which is make associations. And so it's full of associations like violence in the playground being similar to violence on the battlefield, associations with your great uncle who was in Tripoli during the Second World War, and then you were in Tripoli during the conflict in Libya. But that poem ends with really poignant observation about violence and war and privilege and pacifism. And I wondered if you could just read a little bit from that, and then we'll go to questions briefly, because we're
and maybe to
slightly
get a
over
drink
time
as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Everyone's looking very empty-handed. Don't worry, it's really short. It's kind of a series of prose poems. Yeah, just... My dad had been a teenage boxer in the East End, like his dad. It was him who taught me how to throw a punch the summer before starting high school, coaching me through little techniques, making impact while my arm was still tight into my chest and keeping my weight centered. Tivy High was rough, and he encouraged me to hit anyone who bullied me. He said, "Anastasia, some people only understand one language." My dad was the first person I punched to stop him from hitting my mom. In a section a little later. Anastasia, some people only understand one language. And if I ask myself now, given the chance, would I have shot the Libyan soldier who trained the mortar onto Guy and his friends on Tripoli Street in order to stop him from firing that lethal round? The answer is yes. And there it is, the system and the structure and the indoctrination of the war machine that drives people to kill in the defense of the man next to him, not his country and not his ideology, but in defense of his friend. Pacifism is a privilege of the peaceful and empowered, inside the home, in our communities, and on a global scale. For the most part, I own those privileges, but when I don't, it's harder to be a pacifist.
Thank you.
Think a lot. I've been thinking a lot about this in the last few days, and about Max, who was killed. And how I've just never had to make any of those choices, you know? I've never had to, because I live here and he lived there. And yeah, you never know, right? But I don't know if I would be able to maintain my pacifism if I was Ukrainian. Try. Thank you so much. And for your patience sitting here all this time.
I want to give people, I don't know if we've got -5 minutes for questions, but if we have maybe a couple of, if anyone's got any questions.
Do people maybe want to if you want to get a drink, pick up a drink?
There might be some questions also online.
Oh, right.
We'll just do 2 questions. Any questions in the room? There's a roving mic if you do. Oh, there's one there. Please speak into them. Just wait for the mic. Speak into the mic.
But you can also get a drink while questions are being asked.
That.
You totally can.
Hello. Can you hear me? Hello.
Hello.
Hi. Thank you very much. I did just hear you mentioning Don McCullen's influence right when you were starting out, and he is like the archetypal documentary photographer, and very much kind of shot things as they were without much interference. And I think I remember reading that he said that was because kind of war is so grand by itself, you don't really need to kind of narrativize it in the same way. But there's one image that he took when he was in Vietnam, which is when he came across like a young dead Vietnamese soldier on the ground. And you might know it's the one where he took out all the belongings of the soldier and arranged them in the picture. Because he felt that soldier should have a voice, but it's the only time in his war photography that he actually kind of contrived or like doctored an image. And I just wondered, with you thinking about choices at the end there, if you'd been in that same position, would you have chosen to kind of rearrange the image in a way?
I have been in similar situations, and I'm a photojournalist, so I don't. Thank you for that question, by the way. It's a great question. No, I don't intervene in any way when I'm photographing people in a reportage way. If I do intervene, you know about it, because I put up a makeshift studio in the middle of a revolution with a black backdrop, and I make people stand there and look at the camera. So in that instance, absolutely, I've just stopped people passing and say, hey, can I take your picture? But otherwise, no, that goes against journalistic ethics, actually. I'd be fired if I did that and didn't tell someone. by any of the magazines I work for. And actually, not that it matters, and poems are poems, but I fact check all my poems too. Everything in them happened and is real. And I know poetry doesn't have to be that, but it's so, like the truth, I don't think, just for me anyway, like Don McCullin said, war is grand. For me, it's not, it's pitiful. But still, I agree with the idea that one doesn't have to interfere either. And in fact, the worse, the more horrific and difficult things are, I think, the less we need beautiful language, the less we need dramatic lighting. I mean, brevity is something that I'm learning slowly in poetry, not when I come and talk to people though. I'm sorry about that.
Me neither.
Thank you for your question.
One more? Oh no, there's two. Fight it out. There's three. They're all sing with each other. Maybe, can we take all three questions in one go, and then we can answer them all in one go?
Thanks a lot, Anastasia. That was a really great talk. So there's always this debate in terms of what's the innate nature of humans, right? There's the Hobbesian idea that, okay, we're quite bad, and the Rousseauian idea that we're actually quite good. So from your experience, vast experience being like a war journalist and going to different, and seeing the different side of humans really, where do you stand in that kind of spectrum in understanding what is the innate nature of humans? Are we like innately quite good, or are we quite messed up?
That's a really good question.
If you ask we'll take them all at the same
All
time.
right, really quickly. It's great to understand from you what kind of emotions that you can convey through poetry and photography, and the stories that you can tell through those two mediums. I wonder if there's anything left that you would like to convey to people using prose, or I would love to hear your thoughts about what you could convey through prose for your experience.
And then this person behind you. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Arthur. I'm a founder of Project Ukraine, so we're trying to rebuild the country and make the world a better place. But what was your sense, when you were talking to all these folks recently? What's the overarching emotion? How do they think the war is going to end? If there is, one answer, just what's in the air for them? Thank you.
That's a great question too. I wish I had the answer to that. Who knows?
Are they optimistic? Just that close to the front line?
Most people are depressed. Not even in a dramatic way, just depressed. That I know anyway. You can't go to work. You can't make a plan for your, I don't need to tell you this, of course, but make a plan for your career progression. You don't know where your kids will go to school. You can't even arrange to have brunch with your siblings at the weekend because something might just fall out of the sky as it does so often. So I think, so my friends are depressed, and that's the word they use. And Alyssa uses that as well. She says she fell into a depression that she's never had before. I don't know. If I go and ask someone, I'm a journalist from the UK, tell me what you think, and someone was in a good mood, I'm sorry, I can't. And I don't know either. Thank you for your question. And I think that people are innately good, but they do bad things. But I don't know that again. That my answer to that might change depending.
I
on
think you say that I think that's what that last
Do you think?
poem is. That really, war is someone defending their friend. That's that's what it boils down to.
I don't think people. I mean, also though, we're always so surprised, aren't we? I read this beautiful quote in The Great War and Modern Memory. Okay, I don't have time to think about it enough. But anyway, the author was quoting someone else in it, and he said, war is innately always ironic because wars are always much more terrible than we ever expect them to be. And I was quite struck by that. And he was referring to the First World War, and I thought, oh, I don't really know if that's true. But I think as an outsider, that's my experience with Ukraine as well. It's like, oh my God, how could this have happened? It's so unbelievable. It's so terrible. Just when you think it couldn't be any more terrible, just when you think it's 2022. And then I say to myself, okay, but like, why are you surprised? We know what people are. This isn't the first time this has happened, and it won't be the last. But at the same time, I don't believe that people are bad. That was a great question. Thank you for it.
And do you have anything left to say in prose?
Yes, actually, do you know what? When I first started writing on my fellowship at Harvard, I wrote non-fiction essays, and then I ended up on another fellowship. I like fellowships.
Good for me.
And a non-fiction fellowship in upstate New York at a place called the Carey Institute in the deep of winter for 7 months, where I wrote 80,000 words of what I thought would be a reported memoir. But it just didn't feel right to me. And I got an agent, and I was working on the book proposal, and I didn't know why, but I just thought that that wasn't the right thing to be doing. And it was only a few years later that I thought maybe what I was trying to write all along was poems. I just didn't have the tools to be able to do that.
Thank you. I'm sorry that we don't have, I don't know if there's questions online. I'm sorry that we've run out of time. Thank you so much to Anastasia.
Claire, for this.
Thank you to you all for coming. Thank you to your publisher, Smith Dorstop, for their help getting all of this together and for publishing this book.
Yes,
and for being
thank
lovely. The book is completely stunning, it's profound, it's poignant, it's shocking, it's beautiful. I encourage you all to go and buy it. It is for sale over there, right by the bar. Good news, the bar is still open for 20 minutes. So in that time, you can get your book signed, chat to each other, chat to Anastasia. You could even, this reading room has all the dictionaries in it, so you could potentially learn Ukrainian from the Ukrainian to English dictionary. This is our last event of before the summer, and we're back in September with loads of events which will go up online in the next few weeks. So have a look at all of those. And we have sent you a discount for membership, so please consider becoming a member of this gorgeous library. Thank you so much all for being here, and thank you to Anastasia.